On a more sober tone now, we have the ongoing war against Ukraine for 3 years now. There are competing concepts of ending this war, and all of them have different consequences for Ukraine, for European security, and for global security. Let's see the lessons so far and some of the future deterrence strategies. We have 3 keynote speakers for this session. Let me first welcome Péter Sztáray, Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade and State Secretary for Security Policy and Energy Policy in Hungary. And he's not here now, so let me move on. The second speaker I'm honored to announce is Matthew Sussex. Yes. Visiting fellow from the Australian National University Strategic and Defence Studies Centre in Canberra. She's a leading expert on strategic policy with a particular focus on Australian defence policy, Chinese and Russian strategic policy. Please welcome our speaker now.
Well, thank you so much for those kind words of introduction. Thank you particularly to the organisers, the Equilibrium Institute, for putting on this conference today. And I'm very humbled to be here with you in Budapest, and I hope that you will endure the remarks of an Australian about Ukraine. That's right, an Australian, not a typo, not an Austrian about Ukraine, an Australian about Ukraine. Many other panels have discussed in granular detail the prospects, origins, conduct of the conflict in Ukraine. So I, in this later session, think that I will probably confine myself to some relatively general observations. And today marks 1,180 days since Vladimir Putin's illegal, unprovoked, and barbaric full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which he and his advisors thought would be over in about a week. So it's certainly gone on longer than he thought. And while I think there were plenty of off-ramps provided or offered to Putin before the war, and there have certainly been plenty offered since, one consistent theme in how the Kremlin has approached this conflict has been pretty much disinclination to accept any of those off-ramps. Instead, the Russian leader and the Kremlin has insisted on a maximalist victory that his armed forces have been singularly unable to bring about on his behalf. And I think far from being a serious position for negotiations, Russian diplomacy has been really little more than a timetable for Ukraine and its friends to implement the Kremlin's demands. Putin's peace, therefore, is a rump Ukraine, economically crippled and unable to protect itself. If he's able to achieve it or allowed to achieve it unchecked, then I think nowhere really in Europe is going to be safe, especially those countries that have experienced the challenges of Russian armed forces on their territory in the Baltic states, in Poland, in the Czech Republic and Slovakia, and of course in Hungary as well. Putin's vision of a Yalta 2.0 would usher in a new age of empires, making anyone other than the chosen 3 little more than supplicants and satrapies. So, what have we learned in the 3 years and more of fighting? Too often, I think, we have become so fixated on peace at any cost that we've learned the wrong lessons. Today, I'd like to outline a few lessons that we've learned about Russia and a few lessons that we've learned about ourselves. And unless we learn those lessons correctly, any peace that we might see in Ukraine will be partial, unfair, and brief. And I think amidst all the talk of Europe finally waking up, it should really be to the West's eternal shame that the opportunity to wake up has been provided by so many thousands of dead Ukrainians. The first lesson I'd like to mention is that despite its protestations, the Russian regime clearly has demonstrated time and again that it has scant regard for international agreements and laws. In its invasion of Ukraine, Russia has violated not only the UN Charter, but the 1994 Budapest Memorandum on Security, the 1997 Bilateral Treaty on Friendship and Cooperation, and the 2003 border demarcation, which was approved by Putin himself and which recognised Ukrainian sovereignty over Crimea. The second lesson I'd like to mention is that despite linking sovereignty and human rights together and asserting that the rights of one person end when another's begin, Russia is hardly a beacon of virtue on that score, certainly as Ukrainian citizens in Bucha might have been able to attest if they hadn't in fact been brutally massacred by Russian troops. A third lesson is that some regimes are simply not deterred by what would deter Western nations. Sanctions, ostracism from clubs of various types are seen in Moscow as badges of honour, and certainly US assurances that NATO forces would certainly not be deployed in Ukraine were really taken by the Kremlin as little more than a green light to invade. The final lesson I want to mention is that unless our action-reaction loop with Putin is broken, then the Kremlin will always have escalation control. Its nuclear saber-rattling, its warnings of world war, flagrant act of sabotage in Europe by Russian proxies are all designed to communicate that the Kremlin has a higher risk appetite, and this must not be allowed to continue. In short, the only conclusion we can reach, I'm afraid, is that Putin's Russia is indeed a rogue regime. It is the world's chief international rule breaker, a violent power clinging to dreams of past empires. In bringing the DPRK, a nuclear-armed power, into Europe's biggest land war since World War II, it's broadened the conflict so that now it has great relevance for the strategic longitudes of any country in Asia, including my own country of Australia. And I think while we may all wish for peace, it's patently obvious that Putin will not stop at Ukraine. And given that, all European and Western countries have a choice to make. Are we going to stand up to bullies, or are we going to tacitly help them destroy an order that has been basically the supporter of strategic stability for decades? My own country in Australia is quite proud to be standing for freedom and law and order through its active and ongoing support for Ukraine. And I think through its own proud history of resisting subjugation, I know that the people of Hungary share that vision, which is not only the correct ethical choice, but is really the only strategic viable one as well. Thank you very much.